ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. 20 years ago, the rule of Saddam Hussein's regime was brought to an end, ushering in a new era for Iraq, the Middle East, and the wider world. The war that overthrew the regime remains contentious among Iraqis, the region, and definitely in the United States and Europe. For sure, war is never a good option. And for many Iraqis who fought hard, relentlessly for decades to bring down the dictatorial regime, this action, the removal, overthrowing of this regime by outside powers was definitely not a good option, was not a preferred option. But for many Iraqis who have endured horrors under the previous regime, from genocide, discrimination, wars, sanctions, you name it, this was the only option to end that nightmare. It was a moment of salvation for many Iraqis from that brutal dictatorship, from the long nightmare of tyranny, and this is a fundamental fact that should not be overlooked. With dictatorship gone, Iraq had a chance to heal its wounds and forge a new path based on coexistence and security. However, I have to admit and acknowledge, painfully, those expectations and hopes have not been fully realized. The transition has been anything but easy or smooth. The legacy inherited was far more difficult than anticipated. Decades of tyranny, oppression, genocide, wars, sanctions has had a profound impact, traumatizing the people of Iraq. Further, the transition has been mired in much trouble, chaos, and violence with the onslaught of terrorism to unprecedented levels, which swept the country and tried to push us beyond the brink. Many international and regional actors intervened directly or indirectly, complicating this process. Iraq historically, and certainly at that stage, has been most consequential in this neighborhood, which has by and large been wary of Iraq and its prospects. So we have witnessed this unprecedented levels of intervention, direct and indirect. This Iraqi transition became a global and regional competition and a rivalry zone, admittedly aided and abetted by the serious and deep political divisions and rivalries within the country itself. In this context, the premise on the eve of the removal of the regime was mired by missteps and mistakes by Iraq's political elite. We have to shoulder responsibility for making that transition far more difficult and costly to the people of Iraq than necessary. However, for many inside Iraq, the pain of transition pale in comparison to the horrors they had to endure under dictatorship for decades. While Iraq has fallen short of the aspirations that greeted its liberation, it has also made notable strides. A new constitution approved by voters, 6 democratic transfers of power, and an open polity that has been unleashed after decades of repression. And decidedly better economic prospects. And given the regional perspectives, one can say Iraq is not a source of aggression against its neighbors. Instead, it is trying to integrate into the region and in fact leading regional cooperation and economic partnerships in our neighborhood. To be realistic and objective, Iraq continues to struggle with deep-rooted problems that stem from decades of political and governance failures and challenges. The scars of dictatorship, ethnic and sectarian violence have not entirely healed. Political deadlock, constitutional disputes, ethnic and religious tensions, poor governance, and corruption poses serious challenges to the country. All of this at a time when we are also faced with a monumental environmental crisis that requires urgent attention. We must acknowledge that the constitutional order we set after 2003 led to a structurally weak, constrained state dominated by non-state actors. From my perspective, the system has run its course after 20 years. Iraq requires fundamental reforms, a sincere reconciliation between its constituent communities, a historic pact between the state and society, and a commitment to good governance and reforms. As I stated repeatedly during my time as Iraq's president, the country needs a new constitutional and political contract that should enshrine good governance and redefines the relationship between the government and the people. Critically, the 2005 Constitution, historic when it was introduced, needs to be amended to reflect the lessons of the past 20 years and hopes for the next 20. While we need to address these political challenges and reforms of the country, I have to also point to a looming environmental disaster afflicting our country. The country is one of the most at risk from climate change impact. According to the United Nations Environmental Program, Iraq is among the five most vulnerable globally to decreased water and food availability and extreme temperatures. These factors pose long-term threats to the living conditions of millions of Iraqis, to the long-term sustainability of our economy, and to Iraq's national security. The negative impacts of climate change are well documented, and they will only get worse unless we act with immediacy and resolve. The effects of climate change are being compounded by the lack of this urgent action needed, and the continuation of wasteful practices that assume water availability is unlimited and that the energy and resource conversations are not necessary. As a result of these factors, 54% of our country is under serious threat of land degradation. And desertification is now affecting nearly 39% of the land area. Dam building on the headwaters of our twin rivers from Iran and Turkey has reduced the amount of water reaching Iraq, and as a result, the salt wedge of the Gulf is migrating up the southern portion of Iraq, negatively affecting our agriculture production and causing Basra to suffer from lack of drinking water. The potential human cost of these changes are immense. 7 million Iraqis have already been affected one way or the other by drought and the risk of displacement. According to Iraq's Ministry of Water Resources, and we have a former distinguished Minister of Water Resources with us, Mr. Janabi, according to the Ministry of Water Resources, the country could face a shortfall of as much as 10.8 billion cubic meters of water annually by 2035. This deficit is based on the shortfall between what is predicted to reach Iraq and what Iraq will need for agriculture, industrial and domestic use, and that does not include the potential effects of climate change on snow and rainfall and the losses due to evaporation and increased temperatures. This is truly a crucial challenge. Mesopotamia, the land of the two rivers. Ardus Sawat, which was the old historic name of Iraq. This was the land of the greenery, is now turning into arid desert land. This has to be addressed, and it is of consequence not only to the Iraqis, but is of consequence to the entirety of the region. In order to address this fully and definitively, this will have to come as part of the need for our economic reforms and economic restructuring, and particularly reforming our oil-dependent economy, which provides most of the country's exports and state revenues. The country needs definitely to foster economic diversification and a dynamic private sector that tackle long-term challenges of climate change. To be fair, those of you who have visited Baghdad recently and visited the south, not to mention the Kurdistan region, you will see quite a lot of economic activity and private sector investment that is beginning to bring the country up. The title of this conversation, هذه الحوارات, the regional perspectives. Iraq is a unique country, is of consequence to everybody in this neighborhood. In the presence of so many distinguished experts, I will dare speak my mind and say, this is the place, Mesopotamia, is where the great powers of this neighborhood, Anatolia, Persia, and Arabia, have always come together, collided. This is where more often than not, regional balances have been defined. This has been the case for millennia. In the 20th century, the British have arrived. In the 21st century, the Americans have come. But the fundamentals remain the same. Mesopotamia is of consequence. Everybody has a stake in this country, in the future of this country. And we may all sit down and be judgmental about what is going on in Iraq. As I said, we have to reflect upon a lot of these things from our inner selves, from inside. But as we look at our prospects and deal with our challenges, we need to recognize we are not an island in the Pacific. We live in quite an interesting neighborhood. And if you look back at history, and I'm going to depart from my written notes, Iraq has always been, from the perspective of many of the actors in this neighborhood, has been a source of aggression, has been a source of trouble, has been a source of conflict. From inside of Iraq, we look and we say everybody is trying to take us one way or another. Iraq fought an 8 war. Saddam fought 8 years of war with Iran, paid for mostly by Iraqi resources and lives. And we still, I think, pay debt incurred from those days. I say, enough of this. We don't need Iraq to be the gate for whoever. We do not want Iraq to be the avenue for the liberation or this or that country or whatever mission is being defined. I think most Iraqis have had enough of all these dynamics. The way we look at our geopolitics is that instead of us being part of this power rivalry in this neighborhood, our best asset is to turn it around and become a bridge. Iraq's population today, Iraq's population in 2003, when the war happened, when the regime was overthrown, was 28 million. Today is 42 million. 2050 will be 80 million. With these huge challenges that we have, and I'm sure the same applies to Turkey in certain ways in terms of population growth, to a degree to Iran, definitely to Egypt, to Jordan. I don't have data from the Gulf per se, but we have huge challenges in this region. God has endowed us with huge resources. Instead of these being squandered on wars and conflict, we need to really invest these in terms of creating markets. And for Iraq's security, for our future, we have a vital stake in making sure that there is regional integration and creating infrastructure that bind this region together. And yes, different actors have different views about where this should go. But I think this is the way to go forward in order to make sure war will no longer become an option for any of these actors around us or within Iraq. Iraq has hosted Baghdad conference during the previous government on a couple of occasions where neighbors have come. And one session was hosted by King Abdullah of Jordan. I think fairly soon, Prime Minister Soudani will be hosting a new expanded version of this Baghdad conference in which neighbors are coming together and to talk specifics about infrastructure work that we have to develop to create jobs for these growing populations of ours. And to really create this interdependency. I'll be honest with you, this is one way for Iraq, or at least many of us in Iraq are speaking about this and want it this way, want to turn the dynamics, the narrative, to creating opportunities, getting Iraq to become the indispensable bridge to bring the country together. I want to conclude with the following notion. Iraq is an amazing paradox. You go to Baghdad, even at the most difficult of times, remains impressive, remains beacon of culture and arts. Iraq, once again, a great, industrious, creative population. I'm talking Iraq in Basra, I'm talking Mosul, I'm talking Kurdistan, I'm talking these various communities. I wish you were with us last week, or actually 3 days ago in Suleymaniye. We were having this international music festival where we had great artists from Turkey, from Azerbaijan, from Iran, from Baghdad, from Syria, and obviously from Kurdistan itself. You could see the vibrance of this population, especially the younger population who can, yes, I'm Kurdish and I'm proud of my identity. An Arab is proud of his identity. A Shia is who he is. A Sunni is whatever it is. But at the end of the day, kids in Erbil and in Basra and in Mosul all share the same vision. They want to have good jobs, to have dignity, and to have a decent future. The same applies to the Gulf. The same applies to Jordan, to other countries. It's time we move beyond the politics of the past. And while we reflect about the 20th anniversary, that paradox of Iraq, where this wealth of population, of culture, of natural resources, and these failures of state and politics across the region, not just Iraq, needs to be reflected upon. And hopefully what the Europeans did after the Second World War, and Europe went through so many devastating wars, far more violent and bitter and hateful than whatever war we have gone through in the Middle East. Yet after the Second World War, through creating infrastructure, a common market, interdependency, they moved into a different era. Some people may say, what about Ukraine? Well, but fundamental of the fact, Europeans managed to overcome centuries of sectarian, religious, ethnic world wars. Not that much has happened in this part of the world. I hope with good leadership we can do this, and the region has a stake in Iraq. We have a stake in the region to making sure that our future is different from our past. The next 20 years will hopefully be far, far better than the last 20 years. Thank you very much.
I'm very grateful to you all for indeed a very spectacular turnout, which says something about how much this framing speaks to us all. And I'm very grateful also to Georgetown, because the US has moved on. You don't have much of a commemoration in the US today. The region is left behind, stranded with the consequences, many of which have been felt indeed in our personal lives. So I hope that the reflections we'll have, and you've just set the tone, will not only be regional, but also be quite personal, maybe emotional in some ways. I think the region has suffered a lot from distant commentary, from punditry from abroad, and it's a privilege to be part of this conversation on regional terms. This framing means to me a lot because I went to Iraq in '98 as a young man for an internship and stayed 7 years, which says something about the magnetism of Iraq, of which Barham Salih is a very good example. So to you, this time frame of 20 years was one in which you exercised pivotal functions within the Iraqi system as president, but also indeed as deputy prime minister, as prime minister of the KRG for several tenures, and always playing a pivotal role given your temperament and your talent as a politician. And I'd like you to share some of your insight as a witness to the transformations that occurred over this time span, maybe sharing a more personal take still, backed by some anecdotes of yours, if you have any to share. And I'd like to start with perhaps your own personal transformation over the past 20 years in the context of a society that itself is transformed. You mentioned the demographic explosion, a society whose numbers are doubling every 20 years. That means that more than half of Iraqi society would be born after 2003. So what could you share with us about what this has meant to you on a more personal level in that landscape?
History does not start with 2003. And many people, when they talk about the Iraqi history, contemporary Iraqi history, is that the troubles began with 2003. I want you to understand that certainly since 1958, Iraq has not known stability, has always been in one form or another in some kind of serious crisis. 1958, the monarchy was overthrown. 1963, the Ba'athis came, Al-Haras al-Qawmi. Before that, we had Al-Maqawama al-Sha'biyya, and then succession of the Kurdish War. 1968, Ba'ath comes to power. 1970, there is a 4-year peace with the CIRS, but there is also other opponents of the regime being taken on. 74, new war starts. 75, Algiers Accord happens. And then 1979, you have Saddam comes in. 1980 is the Iraq-Iran war. 91 is the invasion of Kuwait, 1990, sorry. And then the sanctions. And so for Iraqis, does not start with 2003. And I hope the world knows this as well. It goes back a long, long time. And my generation knows the Anfal, knows Halabja, knows the mass graves in Al-Mahawil. And you go everywhere. Every family in Iraq has been touched by these events, and they did not start in 2003. And again, I hope that it came out clearly. I'm not saying justifying the excesses, the mistakes, the misdeeds, the abuses that happened from 2003. A lot of nasty things have happened. And we as Iraq's political elite, of course, have to shoulder responsibility for at least major part of these things. But the country has been going through hell. And many of us have tried to build something that is decidedly different. I'm not saying we have succeeded. The thing about Iraq, I would say, Peter, and this is the lesson I take from years in politics, there are no end games per se. In 2004-05, when we adopted the new constitution, we were so excited and we were so proud, and I'm still very proud of many of the issues that we managed to contain in the new constitution. The Bill of Rights, second chapter of the constitution is quite good, quite important for this party, and we're talking about the heart of the Islamic world, Middle East. And we had a popularly mandated referendum on our constitution. And we had a power sharing arrangement. Much of it may be now under threat for a variety of reasons, dynamics that are happening. But we have to have the courage and admit to it. Not many people, certainly in Kurdistan, may not like what I say, that the constitution needs to change in order to reflect those experiences that we have had. And if I were to take Iraq's history as well and compare it to other transitions, Iraq is obviously very different because of its geopolitics and the neighborhood we live in. But, these things take time. Again, we could have done better. I reflect upon it on continually, but I think the prospects for this country, and especially with the younger population, is amazing. And you see a lot of young people who are taking an interest in getting involved. But we do have, as I said to you, also very, very serious challenges. It continues to be a struggle. It continues to be a battle.
Yes, I've been going back and forth over the years. What I found most disturbing at times was how little I recognized the country, not least during the period where you had all these blast walls. But what disturbed me most during my last trip was how much I did recognize the country based on my experience prior to the war. So there is this feeling of coming back full circle despite the price that has been paid. But the ability to reflect, I think, that is indeed new. And I've been astounded by this youth, which is to a large extent self-taught, many of whom, even if they've heard of Saddam, couldn't care less. And are very much...
70% of Iraq's population today is below the age of 30. They don't have recollections of the previous regime. So you can't justify your excesses and your corruption and your mismanagement to the previous regime.
You've always been, not least as occurred from Soleimani, juggling regional dynamics that have been go through so many reconfigurations over the past 20 years. There's also a feeling of coming full circle in a moment of appeasement today, intense dialogue, producing some results. How much faith do you put into
Baghdad or what?
Through Baghdad, but also among neighbors?
Be more specific.
Between Iran and Saudi Arabia today?
Of course, yeah, of course. No, I think this is quite important and significant. And at the end of the day, if we go back to contemporary history, these rivalries have not benefited Iraq and definitely not benefited the neighborhood either. So the Saudi-Iran dialogue is good, positive, and we hope it will lead to lasting arrangements. At the end of the day, Iran, for that matter, Turkey, and the Gulf would really need to come together, and Iraq is definitely a very central part to that. We want to see a far more calmer atmosphere in the neighborhood. We really need to change the narrative. This is not about a zero-sum game. We need to find jobs for our kids.
But how do you explain this shift in the atmospherics, nothing else really having changed on the fundamentals?
Perhaps the way I would put it, there are still important hurdles, there are still important difficulties, but the atmospherics is important. Atmospherics were very bad. Even if it is just atmospherics, my hope is that this will lead to meaningful results. This is a hope. I'm not saying I'm not privy to any information, but my hope is it will lead to something tangible, real. This is better for everybody, and Iranians need this, the Gulf needs this, we need it. This cannot go on. Iran has serious economic issues. and needs to address those things. The region needs a common security pact and an arrangement by which everybody would be respectful of each other's interests. The Gulf needs a secure environment in order to do this amazing, amazing modernization that we are witnessing and continue with it. And you simply cannot push it away. Let me be also take you on a different tangent. And this is something I often talk to my many friends in the Gulf, whom I admire for what they have done, and not least what we have seen in Doha and Qatar is amazing, is really remarkable. The World Cup was a moment of pride for everybody, for every Middle Easterner, for every Muslim, for every whatever, you name it. I mean, we all took a stake in this thing, really amazing. So we're proud of that. But for this to be surviving, sustainable long term, you can't push Egypt away. You can't push Jordan away. I don't say Iraq because Iraq, with hopefully reforms, we have abundant resources. We need to expand these markets here. We need to create this interdependency, Iran, Turkey, Jordan, hopefully with Syria being, hope that this crisis in Syria, this tragedy of Syria will be brought to an end. And it's simply, you can't, again, I go back and grab a page from European history. You could not do what you did in Europe without bringing in the Portuguese and the Spaniards on board. So we need to really create this common market and create these expanded markets so that these better to-do societies and countries can really have more opportunities as well. So I think this is the way we are going. And so Iran and Saudi, good luck, and we should support this thing, and we should see hopefully meaningful changes that will mean a more stable order in the Middle East.
I also wanted to start in this way to make a point, which is that we can have a conversation about Iraqi society, about the region, without referring to the US, which in a sense is a novelty. The past 20 years have been a US era in some ways, but without a US policy. And increasingly we've seen America becoming not quite sidelined, but a much lesser player. Does the US still have a role to play in the regional dialogue underway? And if so, of what nature today?
I think, look, we can speak much about the international order. The United States remains relevant, is a major global power, the major global power, and is still of great relevance in this part of the world. We certainly, in Iraq, we have this strategic framework agreement that is governing the relationship. We want to take the relationship from the security dynamics that defined that relationship in the past to the economic, culture, education, political cooperation, and so on. And I think there is something also real is happening. Number one, the United States is focused on a number of other issues around the world. But, ladies and gentlemen, I think 20 years ago or so, the Middle East was also different. The Middle East is coming of age too as well. There is a growing self-confidence in this neighborhood. We do read what think tanks in Washington would say. We definitely read the New York Times and the Washington Post. But Middle Eastern think tankers who can write will also be heard, will also be relevant, just to say this region is coming of age. And I don't think there might have been a period of time going back to the colonial era and so on, where we all waited to see what the Brits would say, what the Americans would say, what others would say. Now that is a lot less of an issue with us, I think. This is happening across the board. People can decide for themselves, and we know the region better than others. We definitely know also, and we should know, that the United States matters. And there are many things that we would need the United States for, or the United States needs this region for, and we can cooperate based on what is right for our own priorities and so on. And I think this is real. This is not the era of the past waiting for what the Americans would decide or not to decide. Obviously, whatever they decide will be of consequence to us, but there is a lot that is going on in here. And this time when we had, used to have American government formation in Iraq that was definitely more or less guided by Americans and Iranians largely. It's probably less than before, a lot less than before.
You just recently published a piece in Foreign Policy, an opinion piece, which is focused on Iraq, but you make a central argument which I find poses a really interesting problem region-wide. And if you allow me, I would reformulate this argument as pleading to give more power to more players. So in the Iraqi context, this would be more power to the presidency, more power to the parliament, more power to regional, local governments within a system where those relations, of course, would be balanced, offset. To me, it's an interesting proposition that applies not just to Iraq, but to much of the region, because we see in a number of countries power being exercised with no sense of responsibility, no sense of accountability, and what you seem to be proposing is indeed more power coming with more responsibility. And I see a kind of regional divide which I would like you to address, which is not really over monarchies versus republics or democracies versus more authoritarian rule, but more around vision and no vision. Some countries seem to be delivering on a vision, others not. Do you see this divide, and how could it be overcome?
This is a very important point that you raise. In 2003, 4, 5, when we drafted the constitution, it was primarily drafted by Kurds and Shias. We were all afraid of the past. The Kurds were afraid of the future too. For in the mindset of Iraq's political elite then, was never again. We would not want to have another Saddam Hussein. So we went in my view now, reflecting back on those 20 years of the past, created a structurally constrained state and government. In fact, in that article, I'm calling for setting up, changing the parliamentary system into more of a presidential system, semi-presidential or presidential system. Here we will be confronted with a direct problem, and that is of the Kurdish people in Iraq who have suffered, and their integration into the Iraqi polity since the inception of the modern state of Iraq has been a problem and has been a cause of continuing crisis in Baghdad. And if you go back to the history since 1921, when the new form Iraqi state. We Kurds do not want a presidential system in Baghdad, fearing that one day a new dictator will come and revisit them with the onslaught that they have suffered in the past. Shia elites, to be fair, wanted a parliamentary system, again, fearing the past. But now I talk to people in Basra, I talk to people in Mosul, in Anbar. They are yearning for a stronger leadership. And from experience, parliamentary democracy makes governments constrained, especially in transition countries like ours. You need to have decisions instead of the prime minister or the government becoming beholden to these little groups, political blocs, and so on. I'm actually advocating for a direct election for a prime minister post or president with executive authority, and renegotiate the deal with the Kurds, have a direct conversation with the Kurds. How do you want to live together? What are the parameters? What are the framework for this relationship? Will you accept me as a full-fledged citizen of Iraq as a Kurd, or will I always be a minority in an Arab country? These are profound questions. And the question is not only for the Kurds, it's for the Arabs of Iraq who culturally they continue to look upon Iraq as nothing but an Arab country. I'm not going to get into that conversation where it is, because you have in Iraq Kurds, Arabs, Turkomans, and so this debate we should have it. But one thing I know, privately, when I talk to many people, certainly political leaders, they acknowledge that the government is structured so that it cannot be strong. I think Iraq needs a strong state, but an accountable government. I mean, this is how I phrase it. So for this, you need a parliament who can observe. But I think personally, and I think I'm reflecting the views of many of my political friends dare not say this publicly. Now, I've said it, by the way, when I was president as well. It's not that I'm saying it because I'm out of office. This is what the country needs. But you cannot have a coup in Iraq, thank God. We should have this dialogue. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, this is the kind of debate we have in Baghdad. This is the kind of conversations we have in Iraq these days. I'm not saying, again, this is not your ultimate liberal democracy, Western style, whatever it is, but the kind of diwans in Najaf, Ya Kaka Hassan, the kind of conversation that goes on. There are lots of nasty non-state actors, militias, you name it, all these characters that I'm not trying to paint for you something that is not there. But there is also these young people who came out on the street in 2019 saying, Nuridu Watan. And it was the most elegant statement about the dynamics of this society that wants to see a country reformed that offers them opportunities.
But you have systems who build legitimacy in reference to the past, and that might include young politicians beholden to militias, for instance. And then you have systems that build legitimacy in reference to the future, to some promise, some vision, and extending that legitimacy to the youth. Right? In Iraq, how would you shift, especially given the legacy of violence and distrust that you mentioned, how would you shift from the past to the future, and how do you include that generation that is not imbued in the same political legacy and culture in doing so?
I think we need to be absolutely clear about this. And by the way, I stated this when I was in office, and I repeat it again. We do have an issue of legitimacy because every election we go to, the number of people who go to elections are less. And this is a profound statement about that certainly the younger population have issues with this. But I also see the political discourse, the conversation that goes on in the country. It is something that you cannot avoid confronting and having a real conversation that what we are having today here. But I have it in Baghdad, and I see others having it in Basra, in Najaf, in Mosul, and you name it. I think Iraq is a vibrant place, truly a vibrant place. And بلد ولود يعني بالأفكار. It's capable of producing these things. And I think I'm an optimist by nature. My wife always tells me that you always see the silver lining in things. But we don't want to go back to violence. We definitely don't want to go to violence. We don't want to go back to dictatorship. We should acknowledge we have very, very profound problems and challenges in the country, bad governance, corruption, sectarianism, you name it. I mean, I'm not diminishing any of those, but I also see a lot of young Iraqis who are looking at these things, and I see something else also. Very few Iraqis, if any, very few, talk now about the supremacy of Iraq over its neighbors and going to war and, becoming this pan, whatever it is. Even those who demonstrate on this day or that day that they announce, no, they don't have traction. Iraqis want to live in peace. They want to enjoy the resources of the country, and they genuinely want to integrate into the region. And this is truly an opportunity. talking about the paradoxes of Iraq, huge resources and huge needs. Put it together is a big, huge market. And it's happening, by the way. You go to Anbar, the investment in Anbar now, you see a lot of things that are happening. You go to Mosul. Mosul 4 years ago, 5 years ago was a wasteland. Everybody that goes to Mosul and comes back, and Mina, you've not been recently, it's really coming up. It's really coming up. Is there corruption in those construction projects? Absolutely, yes. And it's a problem. But again, putting things in context gives me hope that we will have lots of bumps along the way, but I think it's doable, fixable.
To me, that the question that always comes back is indeed how to shift from this era, the past 20 years, which I think you could define as, or at least I would define as, the multiplication and diversification of forms of violence across the region, but combined with increasing pointlessness of all that violence, as if nothing really was at stake. So extraordinary suffering and waste, destruction of value, erosion of infrastructure, diversion of resources, indeed, through corruption, but to what end? And I wonder if that era isn't coming to a close, not least because more and more people are realizing that conflict has changed in its nature. It's far more difficult to achieve one's goals, or I think even to define one's goals, if we take the example of Iraq or today Ukraine. So how do you see, you mentioned during your keynote speech, the threats that Iraq faces today, and they're not geopolitical in nature. You mentioned demographics, this demographic explosion, which indeed is not specific to Iraq. We have the same in Egypt, and it's scarier. The environmental threat with climate change that indeed will impact Iraq more than others, but many countries across the region are concerned. And I think there's also the fiscal balance or public finance. Iraq is a country on the brink, so it's extraordinarily rich and at the same time poor in terms of its ability to do anything. So conflict always served as a distraction. That distraction today is disappearing. In your conversations with peers, do you sense a shift towards governing?
In fact, talking about the fiscal challenges and the budgetary issues, I was in Baghdad 2 weeks ago, and I met with the Prime Minister and all the senior leaders talking about some of this stuff. And this is, I consider myself a liberal Democrat, but elections are a problem because they make you spend more money. Politicians make promises to commit money that they don't necessarily have. So the public sector in Iraq is highly bloated. It's truly a rentier state to an extreme order. And it's a real problem. And we depend critically on high oil prices. And if oil prices were to go below a certain level, then certainly this will pose a huge challenge. That is why diversification of the economy is important. To be fair, the government is focused on this thing. Mr. Sudani, who has served in various government posts through the years, he has a keen idea about some of these issues. I hope he will be successful, and we should support him to do what he's doing on these matters. Because at the end of the day, the demographic pressure is huge. And people want employment. Private sector is now beginning to bring back money into the economy and investing, but it is not fast enough to create jobs for the growing younger population and certainly for the graduate population. And this is a time bomb in any society. These legions of unemployable graduates, they're a social time bomb. They are an asset, but without good government structure and policies, it's a problem. But these are what you mentioned about the fiscal aspect is definitely a huge, daunting threat that at least may not be felt today, but if we don't take some actions in the next couple of years, we will have some serious numbers to account for.
By the way, I think that's the inability to absorb one's youth and one's population into the administration is felt across the region and leading to an interesting shift or change in the social compact, and then to free energy, free water in many places, not necessarily for all, but for a large part of one's population. So I do see all sorts of regional trends occurring, veiled by conflict, but which might pick up in the years to come. I wanted us to conclude on what I would call the region's extraordinary synchronicity. We've witnessed for centuries change occurring in waves across the region, a region that has shown an unusual cohesiveness as a kind of geographical, political, social unit, despite conflict. Recent examples would include the Nahda in the 19th century, but also the revolutions of the mid-20th, the uprisings in the early, as of 2011. And even today, we see this synchronicity at play with economic collapse in Lebanon, Tunisia, potentially Egypt, or through natural disasters, as occurred in Syria, Turkey, and then more recently in Morocco and Libya. So I wanted you to comment not just as a politician, as an Iraqi, but also as a Kurd, as an intellectual, and as a person, as a father of two amazing children in particular, on what makes this region function that way, so cohesively despite the differences. And just to finish on that, you mentioned Europe. And it made me think that in Europe, we have all the institutions, the legislation, the processes, but there's not much of a common sense of identity and future. And in fact, we're seeing much of what existed fray today as a result of our wave of populism. So I thought it would be interesting if you could share your reflections on what makes this region so unique in that sense and so lovable.
Thank you for this question, because one thing I look back, and in a modest way in terms of our modern history, modernization in our part of the world came with the European influence, colonization, you name it, and we have imported some good ideas from Europe and from the West, but we have also imported some bad ideas from the Western world. One was ethnic nationalism, and look at, this came through Turkey and probably Mohammad Reza Shah. I don't know whether Vali's here, he would correct me on this. Arab nationalists came and took it, and we Kurdish nationalists, you name it. All of this has really disrupted this part of the world. Secularism, the way we imported it as well, in the name of modernity, was a truly mutaassif, brutal rupture between religion and public life. They took the most extreme form of secularism instead of having this debate about the role of religion in public life. And we ended up with the worst of both worlds, fundamentalism and extreme religiosity as a way of coming back to this, and a few other ideas. Now I see the following. My hope is there. I see people can be proud of their identities. I'm a Kurd and I'm proud of my identity and heritage and whatever. The kid from Basra is the same, proud of his identity, however he defines it. But at the end of the day, the priority for the kids in Suleimania, my hometown, and the kids in Amman and in Egypt and in these various societies, in Isfahan, in Ankara, you name it, Mardin, priority for everybody is becoming more about jobs, about dignity. Is the end of ideology that has defined much of our 20th century and even till now. I'm not saying ideology does not matter. It matters. Of course it matters. But what is becoming more important, provision of electricity, services, education, jobs, fundamentally dignity. And this compels me and the other neighbors of mine in Sully and friends in wherever. People will be driving through this. In my view, Europe, if you look back, it was not just about an economic plan. People got tired of these centuries. Truly, if you read European history, has been truly, truly violent, truly bitter. I think this Middle East, in the presence again of these eminent experts, we are very loud, we're very passionate, but we don't actually practice that passion in terms of the violence and so on, the way we have seen the Europeans during the, yet it was overcome. So we see this brutality now in Ukraine is to an extreme level. So my hope is that this priority of basic good governance is becoming a norm that brings this region together. So when people look at Doha, when people look at the Emirates, when they look at what is happening in the Gulf across the region, they want to do the same. Obviously, different countries have different dynamics and different resources and different conditions. So I think this is the new dynamics that is really bringing this region together. It's not necessarily because of a formal, explicit decision by certain group of leaders saying we want to go this way. People are tired and they have had enough. And I can give you a lot of anecdotes about this. It's no longer possible for you as a politician to go on a podium and speak the beautiful poetic Arabic and raise the masses to march over wherever you want them to march on. It's not as easy as it used to be. I think that's a fair point.
And listening to you, I would conclude at my end on the need in the West or in the outside world to also update our approach to the region. This could have been a conversation only about war, about tragedy and waste, and I think there's so much more to the region, but we've been approaching it through that lens for so long that an enormous effort is implied at our end to start paying more attention to what counts, and I think people like Barham Salih are cluing us in the right direction. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you.
You know, Barham, the last time I hosted you was at Columbia University, and you were a sitting president, and you were phenomenal, as you always are. Tonight, you topped it. You topped it. That, you know, this was more phenomenal than when you spoke to us in New York, and I think at least for a couple of reasons. One is you're no longer a sitting president, right? And two, because we had Peter as the moderator. So thank you both so much. Thank you.